Okay, welcome back to part 3 of chapter 33, Introduction to Invertebrates. I already mentioned and gave you a forewarning that this will be a three-part video chapter because of the length and the amount of species it covers and phyla it covers. So I don't think we should be, any more than 1 hour in the last part of the video. So we have two last groups of the bilateria to discuss, which is the ecdysozoa and the deuteriostomia. So we'll start with ecdysozoans, which is usually it is able to shed its cuticle, which is that tough external coat we call exoskeleton earlier, and they can shed it off when they grow. Because when you have such a tough, hard shell as your exterior protector, you can't grow like soft tissues do. So when the animal do need to grow, they will go through what's called molting, or the fancy term for molting is ecdysis, and hence that's why they're called ecdysozoans, because they do ecdysis as a way to grow. There are 8 phyla total for this particular group, and we will just focus on 2 of them, which is Nematoda and Arthropoda. This is again a quick glimpse of ecdysozoa along with the ones that we won't focus on. Nematoda has 25,000 species. It is also called roundworms, and that's what we'll discuss this in detail because the amount of species it has. It is abundant and diverse in soil and aquatic habitats, and many will actually parasitize plants and animals. They do, function as parasites, and they do have a tough cuticle, the coat. That's coating their body, which is something different from the other worms we have talked about in this chapter. Second big group are the arthropods. Is actually a really humongous group with 1 million species. That's crazy. So this is why arthropods are such a diverse group, because of the fact that it includes insects. Insects, there's so many different species of insects out there. And like I said, the book actually divide insects into further phylas, but I'm not going to get there because it is already too long. So we'll just gloss over the general parts of the insects. And there's also crustaceans and arachnids as well within the Arthropoda phylum. They usually have segmented exoskeletons. So not only are they segment body, they have segmented exoskeleton as well, and they also have jointed appendages that attaches to the segmented exoskeleton itself. And these are the ones that we won't be going deep into. One of them is Loricifera. Loricifera is what inhabits sediments on the seafloor. They are microscopic like this. They are able to actually telescope its head, neck, and the thorax in and out of its lorica. And lorica is the pockets that is formed by 6 plates that surrounds the abdomen, hence its name Loricifera for the lorica that's there. And some of them will eat bacteria, and there's only 10 species of them. Priapula. Has 16 species, and they're really large worms that have a rounded proboscis at the anterior end like this, and they will burrow themselves through seafloor sediments. And fossils of these species suggest that they are actually major predators during the Cambrian period. But, it's a very small phyla, so we will not talk any more deep than that for this particular phylum. Okay, and then you have on Onychophora. Okay, Onychophora or Onychophora, either way, Onychophora is called velvet worms, which are, as the name suggests, they have velvety exterior. They originated during the Cambrian explosion that we talked about in the last chapter, and they live in humid forests, and they have fleshy antennae and several dozen pairs of sac-like legs. So if you look closely at their legs here, they look like little bags of sac that is walking along the surface. And then last but not least, you have tardigrada, okay? Tardigrada, or what is commonly known as water bears. You might have heard of that before. Some live in ocean or freshwater. Others will live on plants and animals. They are, again, microscopic. They look like that, and they get their name from the fact they look kind of like bears and kind of wide and cute in that way, in their own way. and they can be dormant. They can relate, go into dormancy when there's harsh conditions, and they have actually been shown to survive for days at even temperatures as low as negative 200 Celsius. That is amazing because a lot of the creatures cannot survive even through frozen ice, let alone negative 200 Celsius. So that is something cool for that these water bears can do. Now, over 15% of their genes are a result of horizontal gene transfer. Hey, not a surprise there. Remember, we talked about horizontal gene transfer as a method for one kingdom to spread genes with another, one domain spread to another domain. And no wonder these creatures can go in dormancy and also can survive in really, really cold temperatures. Most likely, they have acquired those genes from prokaryotes that is able to do that, just like we talked about before. All right, so let's jump into Nematoda, which is the phylum of ecdysozoans, also known as roundworms. Their habitat is aquatic soil, plants, body fluids, tissues of animals all over the place. They actually have a huge role in decomposition and also nutrient cycling. Their anatomy, as the name suggests, they are round worms, not flat worms, so they have cylindrical bodies and they have tough cuticle that covers over its body. It is a type of exoskeleton and will molt as the worm grows. Um, it does have an alimentary canal, just like your earthworm, but it does not have circulatory system. So nutrient is transported by hemocoel fluid. Their body wall muscles are longitudinal, and it is that contraction of those longitudinal muscles that produce movements. We actually have longitudinal muscles in our esophagus as well. So how we squeeze food down into our stomach is really, in a sense, how the same type of longitudinal muscles are allowing for movements in these nematodes. And the species it has is that some will parasitize plants, some will parasitize animals, some actually eat insects, which actually becomes a natural type of pesticide that can get rid of pests for our crops, for example. And um, Trichinella spiralis is actually one of those that cause trichinosis in humans, so it is a parasite in the humans. Oh, and let me backtrack a little bit with the species of nematodes that eats insects. There's a specific cutworm that feed on the roots of crop plants. Okay, so there's this agriculture of crop plants that cutworms can eat. So they will feed on the insects that eat on that. So that's why it's natural pesticide in that sense. All right, so going back to the parasitic nematode that infects humans, they cause trichinosis, which some symptoms are diarrhea, nausea, and stomach pain. So again, just like all the other parasites, you get these infections by eating raw or undercooked pork or other meat. Again, same way with the other one, these worms are usually encysted within the muscle tissues itself, which is why when we ingest the meat, which is basically muscles, we're eating these larvae into ourselves. So females will actually burrow into the intestinal muscles and produce more juveniles. Once they're inside of you, that's what the females will do. They will bore holes through the body, through the intestine. They will drill a hole from your intestine, and that's how they're able to travel to other places via your lymphatics and infect other organs of the body, including skeletal muscles of your body. So they actually regulate expressions of muscles because this is again amazing. What the things they will do that will allow our body to stand or withstand their existence without killing them. Okay, so one of those is they regulate the expression of a particular muscle gene that make our muscle cells more elastic because these are worms, so they need a lot of space to be, growing within our muscles. So if our muscles are longer and be more elastic, that's what can provide the right habitat and space for this nematode to live in. They also release signal to promote growth of new blood vessels. I'm kind of like cancer in that sense because they need to feed. And in this case, they feed through your nutrients. So when there's too many of them, there's not enough blood vessels to be supplying all of them. So they would actually tell your cells to grow new blood vessels to continue feeding them. And that's actually a way that cancer cells do the same thing too, because when cancer cells gets big, like a big tumor mass, they need to be fed even more so too. And they tell your body to grow blood vessels because usually our body don't just grow new blood vessels when we're mature adults. All right. And then the other phyla of ecdysozoan, the big one, is then the arthropoda, which is found in all habitats. Like I said, there's more than 1 million species of these guys. Their anatomy have a segmented body. Like as you can see in the lobster here, there's hard exoskeletons and there's jointed appendages, usually used for walking, feeding, sensory reception, reproduction, or even defense for that matter, which is why the lobster have these humongous pincers for defense mechanism or protect or to grab the prey. So body is usually completely covered by a cuticle, which is a type of exoskeleton made of chitin for arthropodas, and they are for protection, also prevent desiccation because they're hard and thick. That's why they can live on land. They can, crawl on land as well as live in water. When they leave the water, they don't won't dry out. That's what desiccation means, drying out due to no water surrounding. So having that, thick exoskeleton or cuticle prevent that desiccation from happening. Molting is also something that arthropods use to grow because they have that exoskeleton. In order for them to grow, they got to shed off that old coat and then a new coat will come through. Now, during the molting process, it's actually a very energy expensive process where the animal has to use a lot of energy to in order to do that whole process. So and the other thing is when new exoskeleton is developed underneath, it takes a long time to harden. They're soft at first, but they take time to completely harden and protect the animal again. So usually when an arthropod is molting, it is their weakest time of the life of their period. So if you've seen lobsters, I watched a YouTube video with my sons on the lobster. I forgot Leon the lobster. Okay, and it was a very interesting YouTube video about him keeping this lobster alive, rescuing them from the fish from the market and keeping them in a huge tank. And you would see that lobster before molting, it would start to hide behind a big rock and actually scoop sand in like kind of like a little hill that blocks itself from being seen by other people because they know I'm about to molt and I better protect myself because that is my most vulnerable period. So they're pretty smart like that. So well developed, they do have well developed sensory organs like eyes. That's why their eyes are a lot bigger. They have olfactory receptor. Olfactory means a smelling method, olfaction. And then antennae, they have long antennae that is able to touch or smell. All of these features are usually concentrated at the head of the animal for arthropods. They do have an open circulatory system, which means hemolymph is propelled by the heart through short arteries straight into the main body cavity, which is the hemocoel. There is no closed end that goes back to the heart. So what allows those fluid to go back to the heart is just these holes with valves, valves, okay, valves that will allow fluid to go back to the heart to be pumped again. Most aquatic species of arthropods will have gills, which usually, if you look at inside a lobster's head, you will see these thin, feathery extensions coming out. And some shrimps have these too, and you can actually see those things moving, their gills moving while they're in the water. And those feathery extensions is what give that large surface area for respiration purposes, gas exchange. Now, terrestrial species like insects will then not have gills because they're not living in the water. They have tracheal system just like us, where there's branch air ducts that lead to body from pores within the cuticle. Now, they don't have a nose like us, so there's these pores within the cuticle that allow airs to go into these air ducts that gives them gas exchange. All right, so this particular arthropoda phylum is divided in three major lineages. You have your chelicerates, your myriapods, and pancrustaceans. Now, the chelicerates includes your sea spiders, horseshoe crabs, scorpions, ticks, mites, and spiders. So they're named for their claw-like feeding appendages called the chelicerae, which is like pincers and fangs that lobster you see on the lobster or crabs. They don't have antennae, not the lobster, okay, but the horseshoe crabs and scorpions, etc. So they don't have the antennae. They have most of them have very simple eyes, which means they only have one lens. Spiders, scorpions, and ticks and mites are arachnids, considered as arachnids because they have six pairs of appendages. Chelicerae called pedipalps actually function in sensing, feeding, defense, or reproduction. That's the one pair of their legs doing that. The other four pairs are then for walking purposes, just like horseshoe crabs right here. Now, with spiders, they use fang-like chelicerae with poisonous glands that attacks their prey. Um, they actually secrete a digestive juice. So here's an example of a spider. They will actually secrete this digestive juice again, kind of like the other species we talked about before. These juices will soften the prey, turn it into a liquefied meal so they can suck up that fluid into its mouth when their mouth is very tiny. So here is a few anatomical structure of the spider. They have what's called book lungs, which are really stacked plate-like things that you're seeing here that is internal for gas exchange. They're also able, something interesting about about spiders, we all know they're able to make webs of silk, which is a liquid protein that is produced by their abdominal glands within their bodies. They're actually spun into silk by something called spinnerets, and these fibers will then solidify, which is what we gives us those nice spider webs we see in nature or in our house sometimes. So the web functions a couple things. Okay, they can capture prey, of course, as we know it. They actually can also make drop lines for quick escape, which is why sometimes all of a sudden you see something dangling from the ceiling and there's a spider at the end of it. That's the drop lines for their spiders to escape from something. And then sometimes they actually cover their eggs with their web as well. And this is something interesting. They say that some males actually gift wrap food with their webs for and offer them to the females during courtship when they want to mate. That's something interesting. And then the last thing is that they can allow themselves to be transported by wind, just like pollen, by a process that they call ballooning. So they just release this bunch of silk into the air, which then will be blown by wind, which then that silk will carry the spider through wind to another location very quickly. All right, myriapods then includes your centipedes and millipedes, which are all terrestrial. None of them live in water. The head has a pair of antennae, three pairs of appendages that is, become what's called the modified mouth parts. They actually have jaw-like mandibles to chew on things. For millipedes' case, they chew on decaying leaves and other plant matter. They are not carnivores. They don't have any poison either. So, we call them millipedes because they look like they have so many segments, body segments. But of course, they don't have millions of segments, and each trunk segment has two pairs of legs. On the contrary, centipedes is also a myriapod, but they are carnivores. Each segment has only one pair of legs. They look just like this, and the foremost trunk has poisonous claws at the front of their head that will paralyze the prey or use as defense. Okay, so don't pick up centipedes. Third, pan crustaceans, which then will include your lobsters, crabs, shrimp, barnacles, and insects, the largest group of the three. So crustaceans are, all of the above except insects. Insect is not a type of crustacean, but it is a pan crustacean. So if we talk about crustacean, we're talking about lobsters, crabs, barnacles, and shrimps, etc. So these are highly specialized. They have highly specialized appendages for with the anterior most two pairs of antennae. We talked about that with the lobster. Three or more pairs of their appendage will turn into mouth parts, which are actually very hard mandibles. If you ever saw a crab or a lobster eat, they look like they have these jaws underneath that kind of crunch and crush whatever prey they're eating. And then there's whatever appendages coming out of the thorax and the tail. Those are then for walking purposes. Um, Smaller species usually exchange gases across those thin parts of their cuticle because whenever it's thin area, gas exchange diffusion can happen. Larger species then have to use gills, just like shrimps and lobsters, larger shrimps and lobsters. Sexes for crustaceans are separate. They are not hermaphrodites. They have male lobsters and crayfishes where they actually use their abdominal appendages to transfer their sperm to the reproductive pore of the female, and that's how they reproduce. For pancrustacean or for crustaceans, they can be divided into three categories: isopods, decapods, and copepods. So isopods are actually the largest group, more than 11,000 species. All of them are terrestrials. For example, if you heard of pill bugs and woodlice, they are a type of crustacean. Decapods are then lobsters or crayfishes, crabs, or shrimps like that. Krill, for example. Copepods are usually very tiny. They are planktonic crustaceans and microscopic, of course. They will feed on algae or even smaller copepods. Last but not least, you have barnacles, which are actually a type of sessile crustacean. They don't move. They're stuck and anchor themselves to rocks or any other submerged surface area they can find on the bottom of boats, on the bottom of other places. Whatever is submerged in water, you will find them stuck on there. And their adhesive is so strong that they say it's kind of like synthetic glue. That's how strong they stick onto their surfaces. They feed by extending appendages from the shell to strain food from water, just like these brown things sticking out from its shell down here. These appendages kind of stick out from the shell to get food from the surrounding water, which is why they have to have living in those submerged surfaces. Insects is then the other big group of pancrustaceans. They have several complex organ systems. We'll talk about them here. Here is the heart for the insect. They do have hearts that drives their hemolymphs through an open circulatory system. It's also open, it's not closed. And then, well, they're kind of small, so they don't need to distribute a lot of things around their body around a big space. And then you have a pair of ventral nerve cords that goes down the tummy side of their body, and they will meet in the central ganglia that kind of forms their insect's brain. And I already said they are terrestrial creatures, so they don't have gills. Instead, they have tracheal tubes, which are chitin-lined branch tubes that carry oxygen directly to the cells. And there's pores called spiracles that allow for airflow and prevent water loss by opening and closing to allow air to come inside of their bodies. They do have mouth parts that form pairs of modified appendages, just as we've talked about. And then there's Malpighian tubules. These Malpighian tubules, like these green ones right here, is what then removes waste from the hemolymph. Usually insects have one or two pairs of wings, and wings are actually not compromised of forms of legs because there are some like birds, those wings are then part of a limb that is compromised for their legs. In insects' case, wings don't come out, they aren't legs. They are actually extensions of their cuticle for flying purposes. So they can walk just fine, at the same time fly just fine. They can use their wings to do a couple things: escape predators, find food or mates, or disperse to new habitats very quickly by flying compared to crawling or burrowing. So many insects will undergo what's called metamorphosis. We slightly talked about this in the last chapter, where a larva stage of the insect looks very different from the adults, and they go through processes that makes them look more and more like an adult. So for incomplete metamorphosis, for example, grasshopper right here, they don't need to form a pupa. There's nymphs, which are young insects that lacks wings. They will undergo series of molts. It's just by molting that they're able to look more and more and more like their adult form. And the final molt will then reach the full size of the adult form of the insect, and they will acquire wings and become sexually mature to reproduce. Those that have complete metamorphosis, like butterflies, then is where there is a larval stage where that larval stage will just eat and eat and eat. They just focus on eating and growing. Usually they're called caterpillar, maggot, or grub, depending on what insect it is. And they usually look entirely completely different from adults. And when they're ready to form a pupa, larvae will enclose themselves in pupal cuticle, where inside the pupa they will slowly grow into their final adult form. Once they reach their final adult form, they would break open that pupal cuticle and come out of the pupa. And now this adult is then focusing on dispersal and reproduction purposes. So sexual reproduction happens for insects. They have separate male and female individuals. They are not hermaphrodites. They will recognize mates of the same species, usually by bright colors. In the case of butterflies, for crickets, there's sounds that they recognize, and for moth, there's odors that we'll recognize. So this is even though they're tiny and they're everywhere on land, they know which one is the same species for mating by these traits they recognize. Now, female have internal structure called spermatheca, okay, spermatheca, which stores the sperm from males, and usually for insects, they mate only once in their lifetime. So once they mate, those fertilized eggs will be usually laid by the females on directly on their food source, which then the adult in female insect will then die off, and then the next generation of that particular insect will then grow on the food source, and they will become, adults and continue the reproduction process. Now, key insects do play key roles as predators, parasites, decomposers, food source for larger animals such as lizards, rodents, and birds, pollinators. They're also carriers of diseases like malaria, they are pests on crops. So you can see that they have good things and they have bad things, advantages and disadvantages for us humans. But just because they have disadvantages doesn't mean we can live without them. We need the biodiversity of insects as well for the good, beneficial things they give onto our human race. Okay, last but not least, we are at the Deuteriostomia animal kingdom, group of the animal kingdom, and this group is smaller than the other ones. You have Hemichordata, which is 85 species. Usually, an acorn worm is what it looks like. It has the species it has. It shares some traits with chordates, which has a gill slits and also dorsal nerve cord, which is something we haven't seen in the other species. The largest group is the acorn worms, like I was saying, and then the marine. They generally live in marine areas. Some are buried under mud or under rocks. Um, Echinodermata is the one we'll talk deep into or more detail into. Examples are sea dollars, sea stars, and sea urchins. They are marine animals, of course. And regardless how much they look circular and spherical, they are not radial symmetry. Okay, they have bilateral symmetry. They say that their mouth parts or tentacles or appendages may actually not be perfectly symmetrical across the spherical structure. So that's why they are bilateral symmetrical animals. And they are, let's see, and then they move and feed by using network of internal canals to pump water to different parts of their body. And then lastly, you have Chordata. And Chordata, we will not talk about this species, this phylum in this particular chapter because they will cover, but because 90% of this phylum includes species with backbone, which are then your vertebrates. We will talk about the two invertebrates that is in this particular phyla in the next chapter. So there's two groups of invertebrates that fall under this phylum. Landslits and tunicates. Again, we will not talk about it and talk about them in this particular chapter. We will talk detail about them in chapter 34, next chapter. All right, so then that leaves us to talk about echinoderms. Echinoderms include your sea stars, sea urchins. They are usually slow moving or sessile animals, and they have bilateral symmetry, as I have mentioned. Their habitat is marine, of course, and then reproduction. They can go through sexual reproduction where they release gametes directly into the water. We talked about that with the sea urchins when we talked about reproductive barriers is that's what they do for sexual reproduction. And then the anatomy is that they have a coelom and they also have very thin epidermis that covers their exoskeletons. Again, they are calcareous plates made of calcium and they can be prickly. So you don't just go touch them. Some you can, but some are too prickly and you can't touch them. Madreporites are actually pores within the animal. So these madreporite right here are pores within the tentacles that allow water to flow in and out of what's called a water vascular system. They are really cool. This vascular system is what they call a network of hydraulic canals that allows for the animal to move. Okay, so this particular sea star echinoderms uses this water system not only to eat and allow water to move in and out. It's mainly for movement itself. I'll talk about that in a bit. And then you have a central disc somewhere in the middle that has a nerve ring and nerve cords that radiate out into the tentacles. And then there's digestive glands. In the body itself, there's the digestive glands that will secrete digestive juices and aid in absorption and storage of nutrients. Echinoderms also tend to have very small mouths, so that's why they need these digestive glands that can, digest the prey outside of their body and make them smaller and be able to be eaten out. And then there's actually a really cool way this sea star will eat. I'll talk about that in the next slide. All right, so tube feet is then the special feature that echinoderms have that is functioning for movement and also feeding. And the movements work by water system, the water vascular system we talked about. So before I get to how that works, let's finish up the anatomy parts. You have mouth that is at the bottom of the central disc. So on the surface, sea stars look like that. If you flip them over, that's when you can see their mouth. They have a very short the digestive tract. So there's a mouth at the bottom, some digestive tract in the middle, and then at the top of the sea star or the sea dollar, whatever, sand dollar on top of the disc is where the anus is. So it's very short. And then you have small gills on the surface for gas exchange, and there are spines on the surface as well. So there's the gills and the spines that defend against the predators. Now, how do those two feet function? Which is really cool, is even though they look like suction little feet, and they're called tube feet, sounds like suction, is not a suction process. I love learning how these things move because, in anatomy, we talk about how muscles contract and give us movement. For these things, these sea stars, they rely on a hydraulic system to move. So what they do when they want to attach to a substrate, the ampulla of their tube feet. So here's their tube feet. Here's a one structure of their tube feet. This enlarged part is called the ampulla. The stalk-like part is then called the podium. So the ampulla will squeeze water into the podium. So then the podium portion will then expand and contact that substrate because if it's wobbly, it will contract and get shorter and smaller. But when there's water squeezing from the ampulla into the podium will then enlarge and now able to contact whatever substrate it needs to stick to. And at the bottom of the tip of the podium, an adhesive chemical is then secreted to stick itself onto the substrate. Now, if they want to detach from the substrate, a de-adhesive chemical is actually secreted by the podium again, and then the podium muscle will contract, shorten it up, which then force that water back into the ampulla region, and that will in the end goal of shortening the podium. So they're elongating, so they're lengthening their podium for attachment and then shortening their podium for detachment, and they go through cycles of this to move along the ocean floor. I'll show you a video of that happening right here.
The sea star is a member of phylum Echinodermata. Animals in this phylum have a distinctive mechanism of locomotion. Within the sea star is an internal water vascular system that terminates in branches called tube feet. As a sea star moves, it uses chemicals first to attach each tube foot to the substrate and then to release each tube foot from the
That's super
substrate.
cool.
Water enters the water vascular system via the madreporite, which is a strainer-like structure on the dorsal side of the animal. This video shows what happens when a sea star is placed on its back in an aquarium. The tip of the sea star's arm can bend back on itself, and once the tube feet contact the substrate, the animal slowly pulls itself onto its correct side. Credit courtesy of Graham Art.
Okay, so that was a quick video showing you how those um, tube feet work, which is really interesting. They keep releasing that adhesive material and they keep releasing those de-adhesive material to let go of the substrate. So they say you can actually see little footprints of those adhesive material as the sea stars move across, let's say, a dry surface. All right, so echinoderms can be divided into 5 groups, which is Asteroidea, Ophiuroidea, Echinoidea, Crinoidea, and Holothuroidea. And we'll talk about each of them. Don't worry, they're not long. Okay, so Asteroidea is the group that contains includes your sea stars and sea daisies. Sea stars is the one with tentacles. Sea daisies is the one without. So is it with arms, if you can call it. Sea stars actually, now this is the interesting about sea star is that they can eat. They eat by turning their stomach inside out. Now, notice that their mouth part is very small at the bottom of their body. So if they're trying to eat this, let's say, usually sea stars like to eat mollusk, such as a mussel or something, but they cannot ingest the entire mussel into its mouth because it's just too big for them. Also, they cannot eat that hard protective shell of mollusk or mussels. So what they end up doing is they turn their stomach inside out. So this um, kind of like opaque looking structure there, that's their stomach. They eject their stomach out of their mouth, and then at the same time, they will secrete digestive juices to start digesting the prey. So if it's a mussel or a shell creature they're trying to eat, that stomach will squeeze through the shell and open up the shell, access the soft body inside of the shell, ejects or secretes this digestive juices and start digesting that soft body into more smaller pieces or liquid pieces so that it can suck it up into the stomach. The stomach then goes back inside the mouth and that's where the digestion can then complete inside of the body, which is pretty cool. Again, I just don't have time to show you on video. I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere that shows them doing this process. So, the other cool thing about sea stars is that they are able to regenerate any lost arm. If an arm was cut off, they can just regenerate that arm. Now, one genus, they say, can actually regrow the entire body from an arm if part of the central disc remains attached. So let's say there's a sea star and then they have cut off this way. A predator or something else have ripped off its arm, so now this arm have a little bit of the central disc along with its arm parts. So supposedly because there's that little bit of central disc, it can regrow the entire body back, all by with that one arm. That's pretty amazing. Now sea daisies kind of looks like that. Let me see if I can get the erasers to come out. Yes. Sorry for. There you go. I remember how to do erasers now on this. Okay. All right, so sea daisies are then those Astoridea that don't have arms. They usually live on submerged wood, and the edge of the body is ringed with these little spines like this all over the place, all over their bodies, and then they can absorb nutrients through the membrane that surrounds the body. And because they don't have arms, they don't do the same way of eating food like sea stars do. Can I? There you go. I want that to go away. Okay, the second group of echinoderms is Ophiuroidea. Ophiuroidea includes a species called brittle stars, which are look like this. You sometimes see them in aquariums. They have distinct central disc, a very obvious central disc, and their tentacles or arms are very long like this, that it almost look like a little spider going around. And they kind of lash their arm in what they call a serpentine movement. So they kind of lash it and swerve it in order to move across the ocean floor. Some of these brittle stars are suspension feeders, while others can be predators and also scavengers for their food. Now, the third echinoderm is Echinoidea. So, this one you should remember as part of the echinoderm phylum, the fact that the word sounds like it. This group includes your sea urchin and sand dollars. So, sea urchins have no arms, as we know. They have 5 radially arranged groups of tube feet, though, for very slow movements. Now, their muscles can pivot their long spines that can help with movement and also protection. The mouth, just like sea stars, they are kind of located at the underside of their body, and they do have jaw-like structures that allow sea urchins to ingest and bite on seaweed. Sand dollars actually then also have no arms, and they are much flatter in shape compared with sea urchins. Sea urchins is more of a spherical shape, whereas sand dollar is more flat at the bottom of the ocean. And then you have the fourth type of echinoderms, which is part of the deuteriostomia group called Crinoidea. Crinoidea includes your sea lilies and feather stars. This is feather star. This is a sea lily, hence their names, because this look like little feathers coming out of a star, and this look like a little lily coming out of the ocean floor with a stalk like that. So sea lilies attach to the substrate with that stalk, while feather star actually crawl with their arms, which is really cool. Now, both of these creatures use their arms for suspension feeding. They don't capture their prey, and their arms would encircle their mouth, and then they are actually, instead of kind of like the Medusa way we've been talking about with the Cnidarians, so dangling down, their arms actually goes upwards away from the substrate because they're stuck to the substrate, or yeah, they don't move. All right. Um, Last but not least, you have Holothuroidea. Holothuroidea are then your sea cucumbers. This is the ones where, in the beginning, they actually you can easily mistaken sea cucumbers as not part of echinoderms because they look so different with the other echinoderm groups. Cucumbers don't have spine, and they also have very reduced endoskeletons. They are not hard on the outside when we touch them. They have more of an elongated body versus circular body that we've seen with the other echinoderms. But they do have 5 radially arranged sections of tube feet around their body that allows them to crawl on the seafloor. Now, their mouth. Those 2 feet that go around their mouth have developed feeding tentacles where they're able to push food into their mouth as a way of eating. And finally, that is all for chapter 33, a very long diversity chapter. The book has this table that summarizes all the phylums and groups we have talked about. So this is a quick, good summary table for you to look at, but make sure you pay close attention to the names, features, reproductive methods, eating methods of each of those invertebrates we have talked about. And after practice question, we'll be done with this chapter. All right, which phylum has a water vascular system? We have just talked about it, which are the sea stars, echinoderms. Which would be a great surprise if found in the body of a sponge? What shouldn't sponge have? Limb, because they don't walk. They're sessile creatures, so they shouldn't walk. They shouldn't have limbs. Which statement about mollusk is incorrect? They are the most diverse phylum. False. Okay, the most diverse phylum are arthropods. So this is not mollusk, which means I still like to use this question because, or use this as a practice question because then the other 4 things is something true about mollusk that you can remember. The major difference between 2 divisions of annelids are the Erantians and Sedentarians is that what? How are they different? Remember what I said about sedentarians? The name itself sounds like sedentary. So, sedentarians are less mobile than Erantians. Which statement about nematodes is incorrect or false? Trichinella spirellus has become a model research organism in the body that is false. Okay, Trichinella spirillis is the one that is a parasite within the intestines. So that's why it's not a model research organism. The model research organism that I kind of skipped over in the textbook because we have so much to talk about is actually C. elegans. Which statement about arthropods is incorrect or false? Oh, and going back to this, which means the other four is true about nematodes. Okay, how about arthropods? Well, most arthropods' sensory organs are concentrated at the posterior end or their tail. That is false. Most sensory organs of arthropods are concentrated at their head with their eyes, mouth, and antennae at the head, not the tail. Again, which means the other four answer choices is correct about arthropods or true about arthropods. Okay, your friend who was setting up a lab on arthropods for your class put out specimens of the following groups. Which one needs to be removed? Which one is not an arthropod? Ophiuroids. Okay, ophiuroids are echinoderms. A newly discovered species of shelled marine organism could be A or N. Which one of these three has shells is really what the question is asking. Ectoproc. Okay, oh, excuse me. This is incorrect. I think I forgot to move the circles. It's actually mollusk and arthropods. So it should be A or C because it is mollusk that have shells. Brachiopod also have shells. Ectoprocs don't have a shell. So that is a wrong choice. Remember that is incorrect. My little circle. It should be A or C. Okay, and that's all I have for you for chapter 33.